the University of Pretoria. As you see, we are recording this event for those who are unlucky to miss it, and they can catch up later. But I do want to welcome you all to this afternoon session, what I think will be an absolutely fascinating and riveting experience. We welcome Professor Steven Friedman here today to discuss his book, his new book, Prisoners of the Past, South African Democracy and the Legacy of Minority Rule. I have my copy here, good to go already. That's what it looks like. And also our second guest speaker, Dr. Sithembile Mbete, who is also going to be in conversation with Prof Friedman today. So a few ground rules before we begin and before I introduce our speakers properly. Can I please ask everybody to please just keep muted throughout the discussion and to keep videos off if you can. It does help some people's bandwidth. But when we do engage in Q&A, to please obviously turn your video on so we can see you. It's great to have the human touch after all. And please do use the chat tool throughout to post questions, and we'll try and get to those at the very end. So the schedule is as follows. We will begin with Steven Friedman talking to his book for about 15 to 20 minutes. This will be followed by Dr. Mbete, who will come in and raise a few key points that she's picked up on in the book, and there will be a discussion and we'll be in conversation. And thereafter, we will engage in Q&A if we have time left, and hopefully we do. So I would like to begin by just briefly stating some bios here. For those of you who do not know who our guest speakers are, I don't know how it would be possible. You would have to have lived under a rock for 10 years not to know. But for those who don't know, Professor Steven Friedman, who is the author of this book, is a research professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. He is, of course, also a well-known public commentator, as we know, and a columnist and a former trade unionist and many other things, and obviously a foremost specialist in democracy issues. We welcome him here today to talk about his book. And thereafter, Dr. Mbete will be engaging him. She is a senior lecturer here in the Department of Political Sciences at UP, lecturing in both international relations and South African politics. She's also a visiting researcher at the African Leadership Centre at King's College London, serves on the Council of a Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority, and is a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee on the Electoral System. She has also been a facilitator in the Apolitical Academy Southern Africa Public Service Fellowship since 2018. So we're very happy to have both of these speakers with us this afternoon. Professor Friedman, I think I'll turn over to you now to please discuss your book, and then we'll turn over to Dr. Mbete. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book. I gather from the pre-meeting conversations that I have 20 minutes, and sadly, I gather that they're 20 human minutes rather than 20 academic minutes, because, of course, 1 human minute equals, 10 human minutes equals one academic minute. So I'll try to talk about the book within the time frame. And I'm sure that if I'm running over time, the chair will stop me. The book, of course, is an attempt to analyze where we are as a country 27 years after we became a formal democracy. I think the best way to introduce the topic is to say that the book is a reply, is a criticism, if you like, of 2 quite common stories about where we are as a society at the moment. And the first reply, which runs through the entire book, is to a story which I think goes something like this, that in 1994, we solved our problems. We had a fine constitution and a saintly president, and we were set for a bright democratic future. And then bad politicians came along and messed the whole thing up, and we're living with the consequences now. The second, so I want to show, the book tries to show why I believe that this is fundamentally misplaced. The second part of the book, the second story, if you like, which the book tries to reply to is the idea that what happened in 1994 was that the negotiators gave away the rights of Black South Africans to the National Party negotiators, that they sold out in effect, and that we're living with the consequences today. Now, as I say, I think they're both wrong, and the book tries to argue that they're both wrong. But the main thrust of the book is there are a couple of chapters on the second perspective, but the main thrust of the book is to try to show that the reason we are in the situation we're in at the moment is not because everything was solved in 1994, but because very little was solved in 1994. What we did in 1994 was something we had to do as a society if any sort of progress was going to be possible at all, which was that we had to negotiate a constitutional order in which everyone formally had the same rights. And we did that. But I rely quite substantially in the book on an engagement with an economic historian called Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize and passed away a few years ago at the tender age of 94. So he wrote a great deal. And North is famous, among other things, for an idea which he called path dependence. And path dependence essentially means, and I'm here using not only North, but some of the people who've interpreted it, that you can change your political system, but if that's all you change, then the future, if you like, looks surprisingly like the past. So in other words, it's not enough to simply change the political system in order to change the patterns in the society. And an interpreter of North called Scott Page suggests, I think correctly, that there are three aspects of the old order, of any old order, which need to change if you're going to have real change, rather than change if you're going to have real change in the patterns which underlie the society. These are, stripped of some of the academic languages, these are our ideas, the reigning ideas in the society on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable and how to go about things. So to give you an example, which is discussed repeatedly in the book, I would argue that the entire experiment since 1994, the entire attempt to build a democracy has been based on an unstated agreement between the old economic elite and the new political elite. And in fact, to be blunt, the largely white people who ran business and still do to a large extent, and the black people who run government in a majority ruled society, was that what we were trying to do was to create apartheid South Africa for everybody. And by that I mean that what the white minority enjoyed under apartheid was supposed to be extended to everybody. And I think if we understand that, we understand a lot of the mindsets, if you like, and the attitudes which have underpinned this country since 1994. And I'll only mention one, because it's a very important one. And that is the great South African jobs debate. We have this constant debate in this society about how we're going to recreate what white people enjoyed in the 1960s, which is that every adult who wishes to gets up every morning and goes to work in a factory, an office, or a shop. And a great deal of what we do as a society, this is not only the government, political parties have all these proposals for how many wonderful jobs they're going to create, lobby groups, etc., is that we're trying to create a fantasy. Anybody who has followed the debate around the world on job creation knows that the kind of jobs we're being promised are being extinguished all over the world. It's not purely a South African problem, but you can't simply imagine that you're going to reinstall what existed in 1960 for white people, for everybody. Because if you do that, you miss the point. And the point in this particular instance is that we have many, many people in this country whose only way of surviving is to operate in the informal economy in one way or another. And what we really need to be discussing is how we're going to enable those people to earn a decent living in the informal economy, supported by public policy, rather than this debate in which everybody's claiming to create millions of jobs, by which they mean not the livelihoods people earn on the streets, but the salary or the wage you get when you are employed formally. So that's the mindsets. Then you've got the patterns, the behavior patterns, how people actually behave. And once again here, I think that there are some very striking similarities with our past. In particular this, that an obvious feature of apartheid South Africa was that the society was divided into insiders and outsiders. And the race was used to determine who was an insider and outsider, not only incidentally, which is just an aside, not only to distinguish between white people and black people, but also to make certain distinctions among people who were classified black in various ways, so that you had colored labor preference in the Western Cape, for example, which meant that people classified colored could get jobs which people who other black people could not get. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that post-1994 South Africa is also divided into insiders and outsiders. What has happened is that the identity of the insiders has changed to some extent. The identity of the outsiders has not changed at all. So the analogy I always use, and I hope I'm not boring somebody who's heard this before, to describe what the book argues has been happening, is if you imagine South Africa in 1994 as a country which is run by an exclusive club. And in order to be a member of the exclusive club, you have to be a white person. What has happened in the last 27 years is that the club has opened its membership to some black people, but it's still an exclusive club. And the old members of the club have privileges which the new members do not have. I mean, that to me sums up the relationship aspect. So on the one hand, you have a very stark divide in this country between insiders and outsiders. And the measure I use for insiders and outside to distinguish between insiders and outsiders, a very basic measure. You're an insider of some sort if you derive some income from the formal economy. In other words, if you get a wage, you get a salary, you get dividends, whatever the case may be, you're an insider. Now, obviously, the immediate point about that, and I mentioned the rules within the club, is that not insiders are on the same, not all insiders are on the same footing. So by my definition, insiders include the chief executives of banks and the women who clean their offices. And clearly nobody would argue that the women who clean their offices have the same privileges, rights, and entitlements as the men whose offices they clean. So you have quite stark inequalities within the club. But as I say, the club remains an exclusive club because there are literally millions of South Africans who can't get in on this club. And as I try to show in the book, this has political consequences as well as economic consequences, because besides the fact that it means that many people are forced to rely on the formal economy and will be for the foreseeable future forced to rely on the formal economy, it also shapes the way in which our politics is conducted. Because I make the argument in the book that all South African politics is insider politics. The only people in South Africa who have a political voice or get a political hearing are the insiders. And this is an important point to make because very often the insiders are confused with the outsiders. So when you have arguments between two groups of insiders, to be quite specific, the argument within the African National Congress, which has been a reality since for well over a decade now, or the argument between the African National Congress and the economic freedom fighters, which is very often presented by one side as an argument between the insiders and the outsiders is in fact only an argument between the insiders, because the outsiders are not represented beyond the fact that many of them vote, but they certainly don't have a voice at the table. And I hope if I have time to come back to this, but it's why one of the most striking aspects of the debate we've been having over land expropriation without compensation over the last few years is that the one constituency of South Africans who are entirely absent from this debate are landless people, of whom there are at least 10 million. And I think you'll find those patterns reproduced just about everywhere. The third element, which Page tells us continues, is relationships. So one of the striking aspects, we hear of justifiably, for example, of lack of trust between business and government in this country. And incidentally, you would have heard exactly the same talk of lack of trust between business and government in about 1910 or 1912, when the divide was between English-speaking business and Afrikaans-speaking government. But what one finds that, as was the case under apartheid, they shout at each other in public and cooperate with each other behind the scenes in quite obvious ways, and sometimes not behind the scenes. I mean, my next book to get in at, which is only, I think, about 2 months away from publication, is about our response to COVID and COVID-19. And if you look at the way in which government has been handling COVID-19, the relationship with organized business has been very close, to put it mildly. So that's the first half of the argument. We didn't solve the problems in 1994. As North and Page showed us, we solved the political, well, you never quite solved the political problem, but we created the mechanisms for solving the political problem. But we didn't negotiate a new economic order in which a young, talented person from the townships can make their way in the world successfully. We didn't negotiate new cultural institutions and intellectual institutions, which is why our universities are often in the midst of student protest, complaining about a sense that the universities expect Black people to adapt to the university rather than the university adapting to the fact that 90% of the people it's catering for are Black. So all of this, runs right through the society. And I think that if we understand that that the problem is not that we change too much, but that we change too little, then you begin to understand a great many things. And one of the things you begin to understand is corruption, because I do have a chapter on corruption in the book. And in a sense, the corruption chapter argues that corruption in South Africa today is a continuation of a pattern which has been embedded in the society since 1652, when the first representative of European society to set foot on the continent was Jan van Riebeeck, who was being given a second chance by the Dutch East India Company because he'd been up to no good financially in Vietnam. And since then, if you look at your history books, complaints of corruption by the Dutch East India Company's representatives, complaints of corruption by the British representatives. Cecil John Rhodes had to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape because he'd allowed somebody to sell off tenders on the railroads, catering tenders on the railroads to their friends, which might sound familiar to some people. And in fact, the high point of corruption in that period was the decade or so before 1994, when, of course, there were sanctions. And that meant that it became, in a sense, government strategy, core government strategy, government policy to be corrupt, because the only way you could beat sanctions was to break the law. And a lot of people who became involved in that process were very eager to break the law, not only to break sanctions, but to enrich themselves. And at least one element of the corruption we see today is a process in which in the years after 1994, the networks which had operated under apartheid within the ruling group absorbed people from the liberation movements, from the African National Congress, for example. Of course, the other elements of corruption which are very important is my colleague Carl van Holt's argument, which I discuss at some length in the book, that actually what we're seeing here is also a result of exclusion. Exclusion in two ways. First of all, when white English speakers controlled South Africa, white English speaking business was dominant. When Afrikaner nationalism was governing South Africa, Afrikaner business became dominant. The black majority is now said to be in control of South Africa, but black business is not dominant at all. And you haven't had that formation of a strong business class. And Van Holt argues that what a lot of the corruption we're seeing is an attempt to achieve that by other means. In other words, you can't do it through the marketplace, so you try to do it through government. And similarly, we do know that at the grassroots, in local councils, for example, people who can't get into the formal economy because of the exclusion that I mentioned, get in through, use politics, local government in order to do that. Incidentally, I mean, we can take this up in question and answer, etc. I think that if you understand what is happening and you understand the nature of path dependence, then just as you understand violence in this country a lot more, and you certainly understand the violence we experienced in July a lot more, because I don't believe the July violence was about poverty at all. Poor people do not burn down chemical factories. There's no, you don't alleviate your poverty by burning down chemical factories or stealing ammunition or setting alight electricity installations. I think what was happening there is that the kind of networks which had been established over the last 27 years, continuing the tradition, became worried and mobilized violence. I think if you understand exclusion, you also understand something which I think is very misunderstood. And I am beginning to run out of time, so I need to be a bit, go through this a bit more quickly, which is that when I say that all politics is insider politics, we have a pattern in the society over the last 10 years, which I call in the book a cycle of crisis and compromise. And the cycle of crisis and compromise means this, that you have a tremendous fuss about a particular issue and people tear their hair out over the issue. And at the end of the day, you have you have a kind of compromise on the issue, or people lose interest in the issue and go on to something else, which in one level, you can say, well, it doesn't matter because the compromise is always found. But I mean, it does really have a very negative effect on people's morale and on people's confidence, etc. And what I argue in the book is that the reason why that happens is that, in effect, the insiders who feel excluded because of the inequalities within the club, because one of the inequalities within the club is a racial inequality, because I've argued many times, I mean, Black middle-class people are very often the unhappiest South Africans. And they're unhappy very often, particularly those who are in the corporate sector or in large institutions like the universities we worked for, because they're aware that they enjoy qualifications and opportunities which their parents and grandparents didn't enjoy. But they very often encounter, in their view, exactly the same racial attitudes as their parents and grandparents experienced. And that is a very frustrating and a very disquieting experience. So if you have a significant number of middle-class people who do not feel that they're the beneficiaries of real equality, then one of the tactics people might use, and I don't think it's even a deliberate tactic, is that when issues start to emerge as particular issues of conflict, you enthusiastically support the issue, not particularly because of the issue, but because it's a way of drawing attention to inequality, and it's a way of drawing attention to your sense that you're still a victim of injustice. For which, I mean, I'm trying to use academic language, but to be obvious, I think people really are victims of injustice. I don't think it's something which simply exists in their heads. So that the land issue, as I mentioned, landless people were not involved in the land issue. The people who were pressing for land expropriation without compensation were middle-class people. Now, why would middle-class people do that? Because they're trying to draw attention to the fact that there are still major inequities, major inequalities in the society, of which they feel that they're victims, and they feel that this is one way of doing it. The fees must fall is protests are much the same thing. And it explains something which nobody ever seems to remark about on these protests and these processes in South Africa, which is the extent to which they land up in very sort of minor compromises. I haven't heard anybody talking recently about ending university fees, which some of us think would be a very bad idea, but that's another debate. But it's not a hot issue at the moment. I think land is in the process of petering out in much the same way. And your danger in a process like that is that you continue to have high levels of conflict in the society, and people aren't actually fighting about the real problem. Or if they are fighting about the real problem, they tend to conceal it. So that's a very long answer to the second one. Because I'm running out of the first one. The second one, there are two chapters in the book. One, a response to Mahmud Mandani, who some of you may have heard of, the Ugandan political thinker, who does tend to argue in a very complex way, as Mahmoud always does, that the problem is that we're still stuck with the same, in a sense, the same political order as we were before 1994. And I try to show why I think that's wrong. I mean, what I find amazing about Mahmoud's work is that if you read his books like Citizen and Subject, you know, and you look around South Africa today and the headlines, and you think, my gosh, this man worked it all out 25 years ago. But I think the weakness in Mandani's argument is that I don't think it's about the nature of the state. I think it's about the nature of the society. As far as the second view is concerned, it was all a sellout, etc. I'm just going to make a couple of points. The first point is that when I say that the patterns are the same, I am not saying that nothing has changed in 27 years. I think I need to underline that. A great deal has changed in 27 years. We have a growing black middle class, where if you're for that or against that, that is a major change. We have possibilities in the society which were not there before. I mean, I argue and have argued for some years that there are 5.5 million people in this country who would probably not be alive and with us if we hadn't had political change. And those are the 5.5 million people living with HIV and AIDS who are able to access medication, which they may well not have been able to access beforehand. So I don't want to say that nothing has changed. What I am saying is that the basic patterns, the exclusion has not changed. The belief that we're trying to create something which existed, we recreate something which existed in 1960 has changed. The idea that the only way you can do that is by business and government shouting at each other in public and then patting each other on the back and working in unison in private. And that means that you can't simply blame the settlement for that. But more importantly, there's a long and I hope not very boring chapter, because I love this stuff, but I'm not sure everybody else does, in which I engage with a set of legal scholars, Tsepo Madlingozi, Sanele Sibanda, Joel Mudiri, among others, on this question of, is it the Constitution? Is the Constitution the problem? And I argue very loudly that the Constitution is not the problem. The Constitution doesn't stop anybody doing what would need to be done in order to solve the problem. Finally, I just want to say a word or two about, having spent the entire session saying what diagnosing the problem, what does the book say ought to be done about the problem? Well, in a nutshell, the book argues that the problem with 1994 was not that there was too much compromise, but that there was not enough compromise. What do I mean by that? I mean that we worked out a compromise on the political order. We didn't work out a compromise on the economy, and we didn't work out a compromise on the other institutions of the society. What happens in the professions, what happens in the academy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we need to do. That's what needs to change. The same negotiation. I mean, I'm obviously not saying that. In fact, I argue against that people have to gather in some fancy venue. But what I'm saying is that the process, which we went through as a society to come out with a constitution which people could broadly live with, needs to be followed now by a process of negotiation over how we open up the economy to everybody, how we ensure that our institutions actually reflect the values and the aspirations and the needs of everybody, rather than expecting people, which really is part of what the last 27 years have been about, to squeeze into a particular template. Because to sum up, finally, I think essentially what I'm arguing is that the last 27 years have been about an attempt by elites on both sides to squeeze as many Black people as they can into arrangements which were worked out under minority rule by white people to serve the interests of a very small minority and under minority during that period. And clearly, I believe that what we need is institutions which reflect a much broader sense of South African reality, a broader sense of South Africanness, that we need to start coming up with institutions, economic and otherwise, which meet the needs of the majority of the people of South Africa, while obviously, which is essential to the compromise, ensuring that minorities feel that they can live with the outcome. So I think I'll leave it at that, because as usual, I've stolen a whole lot of minutes and everybody's been polite, and I think it's time you were rewarded for your politeness by me giving over to my learned colleague, who will no doubt be far more succinct than I will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Friedman. I have to say I have a billion questions myself, but I must be fair and move on to our next speaker, Dr. Mbete. So, Dr. Mbete, please, I hand over to you to begin our conversation with Prof. Friedman. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Vicky, and thank you very much to Prof. Friedman for that wonderful deep dive into the book and what it's about, because it allows me to then get straight to some of my remarks and questions, but also for writing the book in the first place. I actually, and I don't know if your publishers will have told you, but I, over the course of the past few months, have been doing a lecture series with the World Bank office in Southern Africa, and started speaking to them before the book was published, but when I had already read the pre-copy of it, the preview of it, and really speaking about the history of South African political economy with them, to give them an understanding, because many of the people in that office are not South Africans and not even from the region or the continent, of this place that they find incredibly odd to try and understand and to work within, because it is such a combination of many different people and issues and crises in a particularly unique combination, and using the ideas of path dependence that you frame in the book, but also the sense of, not enough has changed, was such a useful framework to start this conversation with this group of people. And I think that and I've said, as soon as the book was published, I was like, you need to all go out and get it, because I think that it's an immensely useful and succinct way of making sense of where South Africa is 27 years after democracy and 31 years after the negotiations to democracy began. And so my biggest endorsement of the book is that it is a clear and really coherent way of making sense of the different crises that we have faced as a country since 1994, and making sense of how much has changed, but how little and why it is that we've gotten to the place where we are. And so huge congratulations to you for writing the book, and going through, I think, the deep mental gymnastics of untying all of these different strands. And I think that it's going to be the kind of book that people will keep referring to for decades to come. I just want to make some observations and reflections of the book. And like I said, I initially read it, I think early this year or late last year, and then kept on revisiting it over the year. And then as soon as I got my own hard copy, and so much of what's happened this year with the unrest in July, making sense at the moment of the local government elections and the campaigns, the book has really influenced my thinking on some of the things that are going on. And so the first thing that I want to say as a contribution that the book makes, and I think a question that it raises for us as a society, is that I remember studying first year politics, and you study Aristotle and politics, and the idea that that the main question that any society faces is defining what is the good life, and politics is then the process, the means by which that society decides on what the good life is, and then works towards achieving it. And it strikes me, and reflecting on the book, that what Prof Friedman raises, that the elites that took over the government in 1994 and the negotiations that took place, and on page 13, he discusses this about creating white privilege for all. That the idea was that, and I quote here, the goal of democratic South Africa should be to ensure that everyone enjoys the privileges whites were favored with under apartheid, close quote. And the problem with that is that the kind of privilege that white South Africans enjoyed under apartheid cannot be enjoyed by a majority of people in the South African society. It defies the laws of economics, of physics, for everyone to enjoy that very high level of quality of life, because our resources are limited. And a lot of what allowed for white people to enjoy the benefits and the privileges that they did under apartheid was because 80%, nearly 90% of the country's resources were dedicated to serving the needs of 10, 12% of the country's population. If you share the whole 100% of the resources amongst the whole 100% of the population, by definition, there are things that will not be accessible to everybody the way that they were to all white South Africans. And so the big question, I think, that Prof Friedman raises in the book, and that made me think, is what is the new South African idea of the good life? When we say that we want a South Africa that works for all, and if we're going to say that it's not going to be recreating white privilege from apartheid, then what is the good life for a South Africa of 2021? What kind of health system do we want? What kind of education system? What kind of houses should people live in? What kind of transport systems should people use to go to work or to go to school? And that conversation is one that we have not had as a country in the past 31 years. As Prof Friedman said, you know, the discussion between 1990 and 1994 was about the ending of apartheid and bringing forward a constitutional order, and was effectively peace negotiations. But there was no fundamental discussion of about what a new society should look like. And that then gets me to the second contribution of the book that I think is really valuable, is that we're so used to, and so much of our discussion over the past, particularly over the past 10 years, has been about state failure and the problems within the state, where this book broadens the discussion to its path dependence within the society, and how our societal dynamics have continued in very similar ways since apartheid, and since the formal end of apartheid. And so that the issue then is not necessarily about the problems of the state itself, but it's asking us to have a much deeper discussion about the kind of society that continues to exist since 1994. The third contribution is this idea of the insiders and the outsiders. In the chapter that discusses fees must fall around crisis and compromise, made me think of discussions that I had with some of our students at the University of Pretoria around the fees must fall protests. And what I found very interesting was how many young people, how many of the students were reflecting on their parents' work situations, and parents who had been retrenched from formal employment in the private sector, but also in state-owned enterprises. So young people whose parents worked at Eskom or Telkom or Transnet, who were retrenched and therefore could no longer afford to give them a lifestyle that allowed for them to go to university and to pay for that university education. And the idea that there was nobody speaking for their parents. And it's no mistake that fees must fall coincides with the collapse of COSATU, and with the collapse of, and with the reformation of COSATU as a public sector union federation. And the majority of COSATU's affiliates now are public sector unions. And so you had these students speaking not just about their own fees, but also about the broader economic situation that they lived in. And it was this crisis, I thought, there of insiders being pushed out to the outside and resisting that. So those are the three sort of big reflections and contributions, I think, from the book and from reading it. I'd like to now take this opportunity to ask some specific questions to you, Prof, about, firstly, in the chapter on the bifurcated society, chapter 4, where you discuss Mahmud Mandani's critique of the South African of the post-apartheid society. And there's two aspects that I wanted you to kind of reflect on for us here. The first is that it seems that a solution that seems to have been brought, or a response to the kind of bifurcated society that Mandani discusses or identifies, has been this idea of revitalizing traditional authority. And these attempts to introduce legislation to bring traditional authority back to its rightful place, so to speak. I'd like you to just, and of course the critique of that, the traditional courts bill, the traditional and Khoisan leadership bill, and the critique of that is that that's come especially from feminist scholars has been that it'll only serve to entrench the exclusion of women and of the most marginalized people in our society and in rural society. And what we should actually be trying to do is to bring people into the constitutional order. Can you please just reflect about those efforts of strengthening traditional leadership in the context of the analysis that you give of this development of the society since 1994? And then another critique that you have of Mandani's book is that it exaggerates the power of the state, and particularly the South African state. Can you please just reflect on the position of the South African state within society broadly, and what you think the role then has been of the state in continuing the path dependence that you identify?
Sure. Do I respond now? Does Professor Graham want to come in? I'm not sure how the protocol.
Yes, I think we can. Please to go ahead, Prof. Friedman.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the very kind words about the book, and thanks also for endorsing the book on the cover, which I was very grateful for. Just one point before I answer your questions, because you did raise it. Well, 2 points actually. I mean, I think you're absolutely. I mean, your point about Aristotle and the good life is very important, and I think I didn't deal with it in the book. But there are a whole lot of things you can't deal with in books because publishers always tell you that as you in the process of discovering that you're about to exceed the word limit, and they're right at the end, but it does make it a bit more difficult. What is the good life? And obviously, I'm arguing that what we sit with at the moment is the idea that the good life is what whites alone enjoyed in the 1960s. But what do I think the good life is? And I'm not going to describe it all, but simply to throw something into the conversation. I was privileged, I think, to hear the late Neville Alexander's last public address. And Neville devoted the entire address to the theme, enough is as good as a feast. And I think that's a pretty good watchword for a humane South Africa. That this is quite an abundant country, and if we started thinking about enough, what we need, rather than this desire to engage in conspicuous consumption, we would probably be able to be far more sustainable. I think also I think the collapse of COSATU is very important. I'm not convinced it's just the collapse of COSATU. I don't think its rival SAFTU is. I mean, it's got NUMSA, which is a very strong union, but that seems to be about it. And I think it's very important to stress that I think that one of the reasons why, I mean, in another discussion we're having recently, the question came up of why don't people organize to change this? And I think that one of the reasons is the collapse of the trade union movement to a large extent as a national force. And the reason, and I've written quite a bit about this, the reason, in my view, for the collapse of the trade union movement is path dependence, is the trade union leadership tried to become what they were supposed to be fighting. And that's been written about quite substantially. But let's go to your questions. The traditional authority issue, just for those in the room who haven't read Mandani, his basic argument is that much of the negatives that we've seen in post-independence Africa generally, which are usually attributed to the failings of African people, are actually, so it's a similar argument, are actually because the form of state which existed under colonialism was not changed fundamentally. And traditional leadership is absolutely essential here, because in Mandani's view, what the colonial powers did was that they used traditional leaders as a form of indirect rule, what he calls decentralized despotism. So you didn't have to whip people in rural areas into line because the traditional leader would do it for you. You know, he says in a lot of African societies that simply continued, either because traditional leaders have been maintained and have done the job, or because urban elites have come along and behaved exactly the same way as the traditional leaders used to behave in the past. So given that, the fact that we've seen over the last few years, and we have, an attempt to strengthen traditional leaders in extraordinarily undemocratic ways. And I mean, I'm not arguing for a moment that, you know, if people throughout the world want regard tradition as important, that's their right. But the whole point about the Traditional Courts Bill is that people are not being given a choice. You're told you have to be traditional and you have to submit yourself to the authority of a traditional court, which raises the obvious question of, well, if this is such an authentic form of people's expression, why do you have to force them? The fact that we've had this and we had the Khoisan bill, etc., which is part of this, seems to confirm Mandani's point. But my point about this is that if Mandani, you know, if we already had this decentralized despotism he's talking about, they wouldn't have to do this in the first place. They would already have it. The reason they're trying to do it is that there are interests within the governing party who feel that what Mandani warned about is what we need to have. And the point is, you know, when you talk about the form of state, and it comes up a lot in the discussion of the Constitution, the state isn't only the government, the state is also the legal system, the state is also the courts. And the courts have consistently struck down attempts to impose traditional leadership on people without their consent. So you can't say that the state is supporting this. What you're saying is that some people are trying to make the state support it. But as long as we remain a constitutional democracy, a very important part of the state, the courts, is saying, no, you can't do that. So, you know, it's for that reason that I argue that it's not really, you know, telling us that we still have the same form of state as we had before apartheid. But the one point which I think is also, which may get a bit lost in the discussion of Mandani, is that it also enables us to look at a phenomenon in the society which we don't talk about enough, and that's what I call rural state capture. So in other words, when we talk about state capture, and the Zondo Commission didn't go, interestingly, the Zondo Commission sat for 3 years and never looked once, as far as I know, at the relationship between traditional authorities, provincial governments, and various businesses, which are a source of great pain and anguish in a lot of rural areas. And they take exactly the same form as the relationship between the Guptas and various sections of the political elite, etc. So rural capture exists as well as urban state capture, and that's part of the path dependence that we have to live with. Now, you know, I do stress this is not some sort of modernist argument for, you know, we can't have traditional leaders because they're old-fashioned or whatever. It's simply making the obvious point that, you know, if people want traditional leaders, then you don't have to force them to have them. Nobody, as far as I know, has proposed stopping people owing allegiance to traditional leaders. The problem is, do you use the law to force them? The second thing about exaggerating the power of the state, yes, I do think that this is not only Mahmud's problem; it's South Africa's problem. I mean, you know, you made the comment during your remarks that, you know, we all talk about the state, we don't talk about the society, and that's true, and that's part of the problem. You know, we're going to a local election at the moment, and the media, which is fine, which is their job, are going out there talking to local people about poverty and inequality. But the point about these conversations is that they're only about the state. And it's assumed, I'm not saying the state in rural areas is in a great position. I'm not saying that the people of Kanyamazani or wherever it is are being well served by their leadership. But it's simply untrue to say that the state is the only problem. You know, I think I make the point in the book, and I certainly made it in discussions of the book, that the current ruling elite certainly has to account for the fact that it's done absolutely nothing to try to change these patterns, but it didn't create them in the first place. It simply let them be. So we do tend to, and you know, to take two concrete examples, just to focus people. First of all, you know, given that this is a gathering of middle-class people, I would guess that virtually all of us, or most of us, live in suburbs. And reflect on your experience as a suburban South African. You know, how much does state actually influence anything you do in the suburbs, the national state? And I think if you look at it, the answer is increase. It didn't start off to be a whole lot, but it's getting less and less and less. You know, private security, private education, private healthcare, etc. And I'm not commenting on these choices. You know, getting off the grid by if you have the resources, by installing solar power, etc. I'm not expressing a value judgment on it, but I'm making the point that increasingly suburban life is not actually about what the state does as much as it's about what private citizens do. In townships and shack settlements, we have a much more complicated situation. And here, sorry, I don't want to sound like a groupie, and here I defer to Van Holt and his colleagues again, because they've done some very important work on this. And the story in one line is that certainly the governing party is far more of a presence in townships and shack settlements than it is in suburbs, obviously. But even there, you know, a lot of what passes for state activity and political party activity is actually those groups of networks, those networks appropriating things to themselves and exercising power, which is why we had the awfulness in KZN that we had in July, because as I said earlier, I don't think that was because the people rose up. I think it's because some very well-organized networks of elites had access to the means of violence. And once that is the case, you know, you have to ask yourself something about the power of the state. I think we've missed a kind of opportunity. It's awful to talk about opportunities when people have died and so on. But, you know, we are supposed to learn from these things to not repeat them. And the point is, nobody is talking about what I think was one of the fundamental problems about the July violence, which is that we have a great many people in this country. Well, not, you know, in terms of the whole population, but we have far too many people in this country who were involved in armed conflict before 1994, who know how to use the instruments of violence, and who are not necessarily loyal to the current state. So if Weber was right that the sine qua non of state authority is monopoly of the use of violence, July reminded us again that that's not the case. And therefore, I don't think it's, you know, I think that I'm not saying that people shouldn't criticize the state, of course. This is a democracy and the state is not nearly as effective as it could be. But I'm simply saying that if we think that the state is more powerful than it really is, we land up misunderstanding a lot of what's happening.
Thank you so much for those responses and those reflections. I'm going to look out. I'm going to go look for that Neville Alexander address, actually, because I think that idea of enough is as good as a feast is excellent at capturing the yeah, you know, what an agenda or whatever for the future. And so my final question before we then open up to the Q&A is, I suppose there's two parts to it. The first is that my favorite chapter of the book was where you engage with the legal scholars on Constitution, on the Constitution and change, and kind of what the limitations of our constitutional order actually are. And what's important there, and I suppose linked to, and that chapter 6 and chapter 7 on negotiations, on what was negotiated to get us to the 96 Constitution, and what you think the next, that we need to have another set of negotiations of the society that we want. And what you think that should look like and that should be composed of. So I'd like you to just tell us a bit more about what you think the way forward is to breaking that path dependence, and what kind of, you say, it shouldn't be an elite event with people, a bunch of people in the room, but what kind of those negotiations do you think we should be aiming for, and how could we mobilize to actually achieve it?
Incidentally, you've just made my day, because as I implied earlier on, I mean, I loved, to be honest with you, in the entire book, I loved writing that chapter on the Constitution. And while I was writing it, I was convinced that everybody who read it would hate it. Every time I hear, and it's governed by people saying, no, well, they really like the Constitution chapter, it makes me feel very good. Yeah, how do I think this is likely to happen? Look, I think there are two elements to this which come together quite nicely. Practically the way in which this ought to happen is that the parties need to, and by the parties I mean government, the major economic actors, professional associations, etc., the people whose constituents make up the formal economy, basically, need to start bargaining with each other. And I need to stress, because we tend in this country to think of this in a particular way. I do not mean another meeting like the ones that the Mbete administration used to have, in which you get people in some kind of resort for 3 days and then they sign a declaration. I mean, you do not sort out, over 100 years of history in 3 days. I'm talking about a continuing negotiation, and we have had examples of this in this country, in which people start bargaining. When I speak to business audiences, which I do quite a lot of, I don't know if I win the argument, but in a sense, I always say to them, look, if I've convinced you and you're serious about this, basically what you should be doing is saying to yourself, what have we contributed to the negatives, realities we see around us? What are we prepared to change? And what do we expect the other parties to change in exchange? And if you're thinking in that kind of mindset, then you're in a negotiation, wherever the negotiation happens and however long it takes. However, the problem is that, first of all, I presented this to a group, one business group, which had some very smart analysts in it. And they made the point, I think, which I take entirely, that if we look around our politics at the moment and our society at the moment, there are no takers for this. Government has a particular view which is not consistent with this, despite the fact that the president says that it is. Business doesn't think that it's the problem, it thinks that government's the problem. And Labour, to the extent that it matters, thinks that the other two are the problem and that it doesn't have anything to fix. So there isn't, what is lacking in the society at the moment, which is going to surprise some people, is a sense of crisis. And that's going to surprise some people, because there's a lot of hand-wringing in the society. Hand-wringing is not a sense of crisis. A sense of crisis means turning point. A sense of crisis means things have to change, and we have to change. Now, I'm ancient enough to have been around in the early 1990s. There was a sense of crisis in South Africa in the early 1990s. If you spoke to business people, if you spoke to professional people, whatever the case was, people recognized that the course that we'd been on was not sustainable and we needed another course. And that's what has to return to a certain extent. Now, the obvious answer to, how is that going to change? And I mean, it's broad, etc. You can only do that by changing the way the citizenry think about it. Because if the citizenry are concerned about an issue, and the citizenry in our case, I'm afraid, is, as I mentioned earlier, the insiders, then you may get the politicians and the business leadership and the professional leadership to respond to that. So just to give you an idea of that missed opportunity about the July violence, nobody has drawn, we've had these kind of vacuous statements about poverty. nobody has drawn sustained attention to the fact that we have within our security cluster at the moment, wearing uniforms or whatever the case may be, people who are not loyal to the state, people who think that their networks are worth blowing up factories and pylons for. So as long as you don't have that pressure, nothing's going to change, because the politicians aren't going to be forced to respond to this if they're not pressed to. And I think it's the same with changing path dependency. There have to be influential voices in the society saying that. And therefore it comes to the other aspect, which is that although I spent quite a bit of the chapter discussing North, saying that I think power is very important, we need to discuss what we think power is. Power is not simply getting the other folks to do what you want them to do. Power is very often changing the way in which people think about things, persuading people to think about things differently. And I don't think that we're going to get the kind of societal change unless we have the kind of discussions we're having right now, in which we start saying, well, you know, your very pertinent question, what is our sense of the good life? What are we actually trying to achieve here? You know, I'm struck, but we don't have these conversations. You know, I consume a lot of media because I think it's my job to do it. And I sit there listening to a whole series of received wisdoms, which nobody's actually had a serious look at in 20 years. You know, everybody's saying exactly the same thing, and we need to change that. So to me, it's a process in which you try to change the way people in society think about it, so that the business and professional elites, etc., start to get the message that the society wants them to change. And then I think you get the kind of momentum that you need.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to you, Vicky.
Thank you. Thanks, Ita. And thank you, Prof Friedman. Thank you for those great questions, Ita, as well. I think this really got our juices flowing, as it were. I'm going to now go to Q&A. I think we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. We already have a number of questions here for you, Prof. So I'll pick a few of them and see if we can get as many as we can in. But just for the benefit of those who arrived late, we are in conversation with Prof Friedman over his new book, Prisoners of the Past, South African Democracy and the Legacy of Minority Rule. That's what it looks like. Please go buy it. Okay, so let's go to Q&A. I'm going to ask, as chair, I'm going to go to a question that directly relates to elections, since that is very relevant to us at the moment. So I'm going to ask you, Prof. David Allen has a question. He says, given the recent past, does the prospect of coalitions leading major municipalities rather than one party, say, is that good or not good for addressing the issues you are raising in your book?
That's an excellent question, because I've been looking at the municipal space, which is what we're talking about. I don't think coalitions are good for what I'm arguing about. I think what is good for what I'm arguing about is scared politicians. And the problem with coalitions is that they tend to comfort scared politicians. I'm talking cryptically, okay. I think people who want to change what happens in our cities missed an absolutely, I'm still gobsmacked by this, have missed an absolute golden opportunity over the last 5 years in places like Joburg and Tshwane. And what I'm referring to is the fact that in both of those cities, you had minority governments. Now, if you have a minority government, your ability as a citizen, and I'm talking now because I'm on the board of an NGO which tries to encourage active citizenship in townships and so on. And I remember very clearly giving a talk to the groups we work with just after the election and say, this is your chance, because if you can assemble a majority within the council, if the governing party doesn't want to listen to you, you go to the other parties and you can assemble a majority because the governing party doesn't have a majority. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge, even tried. And that in itself may be a source of path dependence, because we tend to assume that whoever's in government is impregnable, and that's not true. So there's no doubt in my mind that the more politicians have to worry about voters, the more likely we are to see positive change. But the problem with coalitions very often is that politicians don't worry about voters. They worry about keeping the coalition together. You know, there is a very naive view, which political studies knocked on the head a long time ago, which is that parties in coalitions watch over each other. A lot of the time they don't watch each other, they discuss how to divide the cake between each other and make sure that nobody sees them doing it. So, I mean, you can't stop coalitions, and I'm not saying that coalitions are themselves a problem. What I'm saying is that if we want to see politicians, and that's what we really need, to get up in the morning and say, you know, if I don't do X, Y, and Z, people are going to vote me out of office pretty soon. Then we're not going to have, you know, it's going to be much more difficult to have that kind of change. And, you know, I think you get it when you have a sort of fluid situation between the parties. And unfortunately, coalitions at times turn a fluid situation into a very rigid situation. But certainly, and I do want to stress, you know, there's a kind of myth in South African politics since 1994, you know, which was this kind of myth of the townships who also always vote in lockstep, and the suburbs who full of kind of individuals calculating who to vote for. In fact, the exact opposite is true at the moment. The suburbs vote in lockstep, and there's a lot of fluidity in the townships. And the more fluidity you have in the townships, the more change is likely, because the more politicians have to worry about getting re-elected.
So interesting. Thanks, Prof. I'm going to go straight to another question then. This is from Ishmael in Kibela, and he says, there seems to be an ideological view that Mandela was wrong in engaging in political negotiations at that time, that war resulting in total liberation was deemed by activists at least as the preferred alternative. Was that a correct view? Was there no other conflict resolution mechanisms? Your comment on this, please, Ishmael's asking.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ish. I mean, you're right, obviously. I mean, I know people who've been, I know of a young person who got hounded out of a, seriously, got hounded out of a meeting for saying something nice about Mandela. I mean, for heaven's sake. No, I don't think that view is right at all. And sections of the book are devoted to arguing that it isn't right. First of all, it simply was not possible. The apartheid state was not militarily defeated. I mean, we've had these arguments before, you know, the society's had these arguments many times before. So this idea that you could have simply smashed the whole thing and created an entirely new society is simply untrue. But equally important, and sorry, this takes me not to the book, but to a journal article I wrote a while ago on change and revolution, etc. This idea that you actually change societies by overthrowing the state and creating something entirely new, it's just not true. You know, the similarities between Stalin's Russia and the Tsar's Russia were stark. The only difference between Stalin's Russia and the Tsar's Russia is that Stalin was a great deal better at killing people. But beyond that, there was no fundamental difference. So if we look around the way, we see that, you know, change just does not happen in this kind of boom way in which you smash everything and then you create something new. Besides anything else, if you smash everything, you know, it takes you about 30 years to create something new. But even if you do create something new, it tends to look a lot like the old. If you want to look at the way in which societies around the world have changed, it's been through a political process in which people use political leadership to build on small changes, etc. I mean, in my article that I'm referring to, I quote a guy called John Hoffman, whose work interests me a lot. Interestingly, John spent most of his political career as a member of the SACP, believing you should blow things up, and he changed his mind. And John makes the point that from his perspective, a ban on smoking in public places is a major gain for society, is a major gain towards the kind of society he's trying to achieve, because it puts human health ahead of profit. Now, all of this sounds terribly off the point, but what John is in effect saying is that those incremental changes you make within society are the things that actually change the power balance and create newness, etc. So you can argue about whether the negotiating strategy was achieved everything it could have. My own view is that the negotiators couldn't have got anything more out of that process than they actually did get. But not only were other options possible, but if you want a society, if you want a South Africa which works for all its citizens, you can't create it in that way.
Thank you, Prof. We have a question from David Bruce. He's asking, could you please say a bit more about the state? Even if we agree that the state is not the only problem, my sense is that the state in a general way has been weak and ineffectual. If there's some merit to this view, what is the reason for this weakness? Is it the product of path dependency? Why have we had a state that has been unable to change these relationships?
I agree entirely. David, you're absolutely right. That's the problem. The state is weak and ineffectual in all sorts of levels. And the reason the state is ineffectual is path dependence, in the sense, and that's where my debate with Mandani comes in, is that, you know, we haven't changed the society. We changed the state. We haven't, you know, the point that I keep on making is we've simply slotted everybody in who we can jam in to the arrangements which existed before. You know, the previous state was very good at repressing people. It wasn't very good at governing people. I mean, in the 80s, I did a lot of interviews with apartheid state civil servants. And I remember the one guy in the Department of Welfare turning to me, and I think he deserves credit for saying this. He said, I don't know what to do. I was brought up to control these people. Now you want me to help them develop. How do I do that? You know, that's been the nature of the state we've been living with for a very long time. And I think, you know, because the governing party and those who clustered around it did not try to change, negotiate changes to the fundamentals, it's left with the same weak state as we had before. And I don't mean, you know, to me, a weak state is, there's been a lot written about that. A weak state is not, constitutional democracy doesn't mean the state is weak. Most constitutional democracy, many constitutional democracies have strong states. A strong state is one which actually effectively governs. And you're absolutely right that the state doesn't govern in most of the occasions. And I think it's because the fundamentals of the society haven't changed. You know, and it gets back to, I mean, there's an interesting debate because, you know, David, of course, works on political violence. I take the point that if we're going to do something serious about political violence, you can't say to people, you know, don't worry about all this policing stuff, etc. It's all about the economy, and in 20 years we'll get the economy right. You obviously can't say that, but I think there is an important debate to be had, and a lot more to be said about the relative importance of policing measures, crime prevention measures on the one hand, and the fact that a lot of this is happening because of the kind of society we are, and which makes it very difficult to shift.
Thanks, Prof. I'm going to exercise my right as chair and squeeze in a question of my own very quickly before I go back to the chats. But I wondered, as you were talking about the role of the Chapter 9s in South Africa, what your view is on the role of the Chapter 9s. I mean, as institutions that are supposed to support or buttress democracy, protect it, whatever, how successful have they been? What is the way forward for our Chapter 9s? I mean, if they're not really financed properly, I mean, how do they do what they're supposed to do? I'm just interested in your view on those.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's good that you followed on from David's question, because I think it's related, you know, because part of the thinking at the time, and we're still in that mode of thinking very often, is, you know, you can tweak this and you can tweak that and you can have the kind of outcomes we want. So if we want human rights, you appoint a Human Rights Commission, and then we will have human rights. I mean, it's almost as bizarre as believing that if you want truth and reconciliation, you have a commission, and the commission achieves the truth and the reconciliation. So to me, I think as a generalized point, the only, I mean, okay, in the public protector's case, you had this kind of accidental situation in which Madonsela was appointed because they thought she was going to do something else, and she did the opposite of what they thought she was going to do. But let me include Madonsela in this. To me, in 27 years, the only consistently effective Chapter 9 institutions has been the one that relies on people outside government in order to be effective. And that's the IEC. Okay, because I've argued repeatedly that the reason why, and I think the IEC does work generally, the reason why, reasonably well, the reason why the IEC does usually conduct free and fair elections is that the party agents force it to. If the party agents weren't there, we probably would have the same problem with the IEC as we do with the others. What Madonsela understood when she took over as the public protector is that she wouldn't get anywhere in what she was trying to do unless she got sections of society on board, which is why she used to spend an awful lot of time giving talks and making speeches and stuff like that. So, you know, to me, it illustrates, and I don't think the Human Rights Commission has a glittering record. You know, I don't think the Gender Equality Commission has any record at all to think of, and certainly the one with the very long name hasn't really protected anybody's religion or culture that I could think of. So I think the lesson there is very clear. You know, if you create structures which enable, you know, if you create circumstances which enable citizens to deal with these issues, then I think it has a concrete effect. But if you simply you know, appoint a commission, pay them salaries, it's going to turn out the way it has turned.
Thanks for that. Thanks. So we have one more time for one more question, I think, and I think it's actually, yeah, it's a good idea to end with a question about youth. I think they are the future. So let's end with a question about them. We have David Allen says here, it appears that many South Africans have voted for the ANC because of its history, obviously, in fighting apartheid, but also because of a lack of credible opposition parties. What, in your view, is the possibility that younger South Africans can facilitate the changes required, both within the ANC and in other parties?
Look, once again, a very interesting question, and I think we need to understand more about this. I mean, first of all, just something which I feel obliged to get in, although it's just a sort of routine disclaimer. I always get a bit nervous about when people talk about the youth, because they imply that the youth all think the same and all believe the same, and clearly they don't. But I think David is talking about politically active youth, and that makes sense. I think the question is interesting in the sense that it does seem to me, and we are generalizing, you know, that the younger politically aware people are in this country, the more dissatisfied they are with the political status quo, the more they would like to see changes, the less faith they put in the governing party or indeed any of the parties. But the point is that they're not choosing, certainly the people I'm thinking of, are not choosing to exercise that particular choice at the moment by going into political parties. You know, 20 years ago, if you were young and bright and you were interested in politics, you went into a political party. You know, here you run in the opposite direction very quickly. So, you know, that leads to a situation that we have at the moment, where we have lots of articulate criticism, but it doesn't mean terribly much politically. I always remark on the fact, and it's not judgmental about anybody, but it sums up this problem about articulateness and anything else. I mean, you know, we must be one of the few democracies on earth where anybody who has a pen or a voice or is on media trashes the governing party, and the governing party regularly gets 55% plus in elections. You know, the disjuncture between what people are, you know, saying in the debate and what's actually happening in the country are pretty strong. And I'm not convinced that that's, I mean, I think it would be positive if young people did get involved in the way you're talking about. But I don't think that, you know, I don't get a sense that they're burrowing into political parties and trying to change that. And then you have a question of new political parties. You know, if it was easy to form a new political party, people would have done so long ago. I mean, I don't know any, maybe it's just the people I speak to, I don't know any black middle class people who feel that they're politically represented at the moment. But they don't form parties because it's just a very difficult thing to do. So given that, my hunch is still that, you know, we're going to, you know, if the logjam's really going to be broken, there's going to have to be another split in the governing party, at which stage I think that that youth voice will become very important. If it doesn't happen that way, then I think what you're going to see as a result of youth, the kind of youth attitudes you're talking about, you know, is a lot more vocal civil society activity rather than political party activity. But I do warn that, you know, in any constitutional democracy, you know, you can't, civil society is important and citizens are important, but unless people have credible political vehicles, you know, it leads to a lot of frustration. So we are in a bit of a vacuum at the moment, but I think it's less a case of young people changing political parties than young people becoming an important factor if new political options emerge.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Prof. And I think we'll have to end it there, although I suppose we could talk for hours, but we must end it there. I'm going to ask Sita if you have any final comments you want to end on, any last little jewel that you'd like to impart before we officially close.
No, just thank you so much for this opportunity and to be able to speak about this really, really excellent book. I do think it'll be interesting to see, you know, one of the things in this local government election is how many of these coalitions of independents are running. So they're not actual political parties, but they are these movements. And there's several of them running in every province. And it'll be interesting to see how much of an impact they make on local government politics, and whether we're going to move towards a place, at least at local government level, where there is more involvement of kind of civil society formations, but formalized in politics rather than our traditional parties. And so it'll be very interesting to see that. But thank you very much for this event. It was wonderful.
Absolutely. I think watch the space. Thank you so much, Prof Friedman, again, and for Dr. Mbete for your contributions also. This was fantastic, colleagues. Everyone, please go out and get this book. We need to provoke more conversations around these issues, please. It's important. Thank you again, Prof Friedman. Thank you, Dr. Mbete. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We hope to hold many more webinars like this. Please stay on our mailing list. I think somebody asked the question, can we get a link to this recording? Yes, you can. So if you want to email Karina van der Spoel from Wits, she's given her email address there. She will have the recording as well, but you can also email me and I can give that out as well. So thank you everybody once again. Everyone please keep safe and go well.